Oh, did we not go over it already? Yeah, we got time. That's cool. All right, so which of the following was not a store of value? Okay, good. Which of these institutions is responsible for controlling the money supply? What, it's not commercial banks? Yes, the Federal Reserve System. Which of the following is in charge of buying and selling government securities by the Fed? FOMC. FOMC, okay. Federal Open Market Committee. The cost to a member bank of borrowing money from the Fed, discount rate, right? In a simplified banking system in which all banks are subject to a 25% required reserve ratio and a money multiplier of 4, a $1,000 open market sale of U.S. Treasury bonds by the Fed would cause the money supply to decrease, and actually, since the question is poorly worded, I would actually take decrease by either 4 or 1,000. Initially, the sale is decreased by 1,000. Once it goes through the cycle, it could be up to 4,000. So as long as you said decrease in that one, either of those answers is actually correct for me. So either B or D. And I will word this problem better on the final. Hint, hint. All right? And if a bank received $100,000 in new deposits and the required reserve ratio was 10%, its addition to required reserves from this $100,000 deposit would be $10,000, because 10% of $100,000 is $10,000.
I overthought it and I stopped.
I did a math problem too.
And I was like, oh, no.
I was right on my math, but I was wrong for the answer.
All right, so chapter 20 is basically answering the question of how does playing with money help the economy? All right, first off, when the Fed plays with money or plays with the money supply, this is often called monetary policy, okay? This is one side of the two sides of macroeconomic policy that adjusts the economy, right? Fiscal policy, this is what we did back in chapter 15 and 14. Fiscal policy is when the government changes spending or taxing, all right? Monetary policy is when the Fed changes interest rates or mucks around with the money supply, okay? Now, the theory states, and at least this is the going theory at the moment, is that when the Fed increases the money supply, GDP will grow. That's the theory. The question is, why? Okay? Why does increasing M2 increase, if I could spell it correctly, GDP? All right, this is almost a guaranteed test question on the final. The key is realizing that the money supply does not directly tie to GDP. What we learned last time is that there is a demand for money. And it's a good old demand curve like we've always been drawing, and that the money supply is fixed by the Fed, so that it's a straight up and down line. So when Fed increases the money supply, when Fed raises M2, what's the first thing that happens? The money supply shifts. Here's my new. What changes because of an increase in the money supply? Not GDP directly, but interest rates. So here was our old interest rate with our new money supply. What happened to interest rates? interest rates will fall. Now, when interest rates are lower, what does that spur businesses and consumers to do? Exactly. Lower interest will make businesses invest more, and consumers spend more. And think of the consumer spending to be on big ticket items, items that a consumer would have to take out a loan to purchase, like cars, like houses, like yachts, and second and third and seventh and eighth houses. The increase in I and C, what does that do? It doesn't quite jump to GDP yet. What? Right. What are the non-price determinants of supply, Deanna? Of aggregate supply. What are the? No, that's for the 3 economic goals. What are the non-price determinants of aggregate supply? All right, anybody? What are the non-price determinants of aggregate supply? Now these are the non-price determinants of aggregate demand.
Oh, right.
I'm asking about technology, corporate taxes, yes. Resource prices, yes. Subsidies and regulations, right? What are the non-price determinants of aggregate demand? G plus I plus C plus X plus minus M, right? This is I and C. So this will increase aggregate demand. So it doesn't quite jump to GDP yet, but it's pretty close. Because when aggregate demand increases, so here's CPI, here's GDP, here's where aggregate demand was. When aggregate demand shifts to the right, that's what leads to an increase in GDP. Now, there's a condition on that increase in GDP, right? Right now I drew aggregate demand in this range. What's this range called? The intermediate range. It would also be okay if it were in this range. What's this range called? Keynesian. What if my aggregate demand were up here? What's this range called? Classical. If aggregate demand grows while we're in the classical range, does GDP grow? No. It stays the same and all we see is inflation. Again, this is why classical economists look at this and say, right? Because they always assume we're at full employment, right? That's what classical economists assume. So when you're at full employment, increasing aggregate demand, all that's going to do, make more inflation. That's why classical economists, anytime the Fed puts its hands in the economy, says, quit it, right?
Because they just assume we're always full employed?
Yes, exactly. If there's some unemployment, it's just an aberration for the moment. It'll cure itself real soon once everybody accepts lower prices and lower wages, right? That's the classical economist argument all the time. Always, right? If I ever make you a classical economist, your job is to stand there like this, and you have to frown, and you have to say, no, do nothing, flexible wages and prices, and that's the only thing you ever say. That's the way classical economists are. Right? And again, that worked for 500 some odd years, right? If you just did nothing and let prices fluctuate, it's okay, right? And all those people that don't have a job, they're just dead. It's okay. It's part of life. So the key here is realizing is that the growth in AD should make GDP grow. It's not 100% guaranteed, because if aggregate demand is already pretty close to full employment, it won't do any good, okay? Yes, this is a relatively long-winded argument. It takes you doing 2 or 3 things to get to the end result.
Isn't that called quantitative easing?
This is exactly quantitative easing, folks. Every time you hear the Fed quantitatively easing, this is what they're doing. And this is exactly how they're trying to do it, right? So the Fed is out there increasing the money supply, buying government securities. As the money supply grows, interest rates lower, or they stay low, whatever you want to say. And those lower interest rates are supposed to be spurring businesses and consumers to spend, right? And it's working, right? Think about the car industry. What's happening to car sales over the last year? They're up 12 to 17% over the last year. Why? Because interest rate for a car are still 2%, 0%, right? I mean, you go buy an American car and you can get it for 0 down and 0% interest for 5 years. And you're an idiot if you don't go and buy an American car at that stage, unless you don't like American cars, right?
Or you're poor.
Well, yeah, the details.
Oh, wait.
All right, but this, again, the key here, folks, this is what Keynesians think about monetary policy. Remember that classical economists will always say, that's their job. Yes, Keynesians always say, go, 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 go.
Because they believe we're always in a recession?
Well, no, they just think that when we are in a recession, that it's somebody's job to step up and help, right? Because if you don't help, you may have another Great Depression like we did back in the 30s, right? Because of the fact that prices and wages are not flexible anymore, right? And again, the classical economists will say, well, if we would just let them, it would be okay. Yes, Patty? You heard that the U.S. is going to pay some debt off because they collected more money last month than they spent. First time in, no, not quite that many years, but pretty close, 22, 23, since Clinton. But it probably won't last. But it might, you never know. Yeah, they paid off like $20 billion and then promptly borrowed like, $2 billion right after they paid it off. So but the debt theoretically went down for a month. I don't know if it will for the whole year, but it's there. And again, when the government starts paying off debt, it's decreasing government spending. What happens when G falls? Well, taxes aren't necessarily going up, but if G goes down, right? So let's assume that business investment and consumer spending is the same. If G goes down, what happens to aggregate demand? It falls, right? What happens if aggregate demand shifts this way? GDP is going to fall. So a lot of what people are talking about, while the debt is decreasing, they're also worrying about the fact that the economy has slowed down. The growth in GDP has slowed. And that's just because the government has quit spending as much. You have to take the good with the bad, right? All right, so our Keynesians, we like this. It's not a bad thing. Please realize that what Keynesians really like is this, okay? Keynesians really want the government to just spend until we're out of a recession. That's its job, right? Go into as much debt as you have to until we're back, right? And the idea is that if you pump enough money into it, it'll start doing the circular flow multiplier, and whew, it'll all go away, right? And what Keynesians are saying is that back in 2009, when we had this recession starting, we had a stimulus package, but it just wasn't big enough. If we would have made it bigger, all of this would be a non-issue. What would classical economists say?
We're fine.
You shouldn't have done anything. You're just making inflation, right? I mean, that's your job. Classical economist. Pucker as tight as you can while you do it. Okay, so That is the theory about why more money equals more GDP. Not because when the government gives me a check, I will spend more. Don't say that on the test, please. All right, so I've told you that classical economists, they haven't really changed their philosophy for 500 or 600 some odd years, and they haven't. But there are some that have. And what happened to them?
They were able to think straight again?
They changed into being monetarists instead of classicalists. All right, so there is a third branch of economists that I want you to know about. There's just three. We will only get to three. There is a fourth, but that's for graduate school when you guys go. Rational expectationists. The three that we have to worry about, though, are classical economists, Keynesian economists, and monetarists. Okay? Those are the three you guys are going to have to know. Right? So monetarists are basically what I call educated classical economists. Or they finally quit saying do nothing and said, look, that's obviously not valid. All right? So what they came up with, or what they did, was they said, okay, one of the things that classical economists assume is something called the equation of exchange, or it's often written as the quantity theory of money. Two different names. It's basically an equation that describes the way the economy works according to a classical economist's argument. That's it. It's not a very fancy equation, but that's the equation that they use. They say if you take M and multiply by V, you will get prices times quantity. Please note that PQ, or P times Q, is just GDP, okay? M is just the money supply. And then there's this special letter, which I will explain here in a little bit. It's known as the velocity of money. Give yourself room so that I can explain it. All right? So what classical economists and technically monetarists state is that this is what drives the economy, right? As long as there is enough money and the money is moving fast enough, we will generate this much GDP. Okay? Velocity, this is how many times a dollar is spent per year. So the velocity money is basically how quickly are we spending our money. So if you think about it, right, when you get 10 bucks in your pocket, if you hang on to that $10 for a long time, you just walk around going, I'm going to wait to spend it, I'm going to wait to spend it, I'm going to wait to spend it, that $10 is doing nothing for the economy. It's just hanging out. If, on the other hand, you get $10 and the day after you get it, you immediately go to the store and you buy something, what did that $10 do? Yeah, it generated GDP, right? I mean, assuming that you bought something new, okay? And once that $10 goes to the business, what does the business do with the $10? Hopefully they spend it, right? I mean, they could take the $10, put it on the bank, and sit on it, right? But theoretically, that's not what they're going to do. They're going to use that $10 to pay one of their employees that comes to work, and that $10 is going to move over to someone else's pocket. And since they were working, what did that $10 generate? More GDP. So now a new person has that person do with the $10? Spends it. Same sort of thing. As long as it's spent on GDP, generates more GDP again. So the velocity of money, according to monetarists and even classicalists, is as long as the money is getting spent, It's generating GDP. So as long as people keep going out and buying and businesses keep spending, we're all good. There's no problem. We never have to worry about anything. Okay? Now, where'd I put it? Purple. So classical economists assume that velocity is constant. So in other words, no matter what's going on in the economy, you guys are going to spend $1 about the same time you would spend $1 no matter what's going on, right? Whether it's a recession, whether we're booming, whether it's a recovery, what have you. If you get $10 in your pocket, you're going to spend that $10 the same no matter what. Okay? Again, classical economists assume we're all living in the 1800s where every dollar you got you had to spend on goods so that you would survive. So that's why they tend to think that. And now that the economy has grown a little bit more and you don't necessarily have to do that, they do think that you guys are pretty much regular animals. When you get money, you spend a certain amount of it, and it's the same amount every week, right? And so in theory, you work a 40-hour week. You get paid the same amount every 2 weeks. You spend however much you're going to spend, and that's what happens again next week. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. I mean, that's not all that untrue, is it? I mean, if you think about it, right? Because, I mean, how often... how often do we get vacation in this country?
If you earn it.
Yeah, you're lucky if you get it once a year, right? I mean, you get like 2 weeks of vacation a year, right? So those would be the only times we would spend more or less, right? And it's going to be 2 weeks every year. It's not like they're all of a sudden going to give us 6 weeks of vacation, right? We'd have to move to Europe to get that. That ain't going to happen. We don't know how to speak French yet. That's true. All right, so the other thing is that, remember, that we are at full employment. So Q is also constant, right? We are producing as much as we can. So these two things are constant. Prices and the money supply can be changed. But the fact remains to a classical economist that this equation will always be true. So if velocity can't change and quantity can't change, when there's more money, so this number gets bigger, what changes over here? P. And if there's more money, what happens to P? It grows. So what does more money in the system do? It means more prices. It means inflation. Okay? So this is exactly the classical economist's argument. Their argument is that, look, high as Q as we can be, velocity is always the same, anything you do with the money to create inflation. Okay? That's their argument. Now, monetarists, they've grown up. They realize that when you guys are in a recession and you get your paycheck and you're nervous about whether or not this paycheck is going to show up again next week, what do? You hold on to it a little bit tighter, right? You don't spend as much as you used to do. You will say, look, I am not going to spend at the same velocity that I did before. All right? So monetarists understand that V changes. In addition, they also understand that we're not always at full employment, which you would think wouldn't take much to figure out, but again, it takes a little bit of work to break your old habits. So the monetarist's goal, right? They want to see growth in GDP, but what they want it to be is controlled. All right? They want GDP, which equals P times Q, to grow controlled. That's their key. It's like, okay, monetarist economists, they would be mad not only at our own economy when it was only growing at 0%, they're also mad at countries like China and India because their growth in GDP is up in the 7, 8, 9, 10% range, right? That's too fast. The economy can't handle changes that fast, and what it leads to is volatility in V. And what they want is that number to be relatively controllable. If we can tell how fast people are spending money, we can make there be nice, steady growth. That's their goal, okay? So then, to get growth, just increase M based on a change in V to get an increase in GDP. All right? So monetarists, they like monetary policy, but as long as it's controlled, right? What monetarists will complain about in today's economy is that the Fed is being a little bit too loose with its monetary policy. They're increasing the money supply a lot more than a controlled fashion, okay? So monetarists are looking at it saying, look, we're really classical economists. We don't want you to do too terribly much. But we understand that there needs to be enough money in the system so that you can spend enough so that when growth occurs, there's enough money to pay for the growth. All right? That's the idea behind it. There needs to be enough M2 out there to support any change in GDP. And as long as there is, we will see that change in GDP. All right? So that's the... I'm not going to go any deeper than that. That's far enough. It's pretty deep already. But that's the difference between classical economists and monetarists. There's not a whole lot different between them. But again, it's understanding that... Imports? M is money supply. Sorry. Yeah, it's still the same equation over here where M is money supply. Yeah, it would be better to write it as M2, yes. But the book will write it as M, so, and then say M is the money supply. Right? So the key here for monetarists is steady growth in the money supply in such a fashion that M times V grows at 3.5%, because that's what will push GDP to grow at the same level. And again, one of the reasons why some monetarists are not unhappy with what's going on in the economy right now is that what's happening to the velocity of money? How fast are we spending? Yeah, I mean, we're getting faster, but 3 years ago, we were as tight as any other person out there, right? Everybody was holding on to their money, period. And velocity was plummeting. So in the very beginning of this recession, in order to keep GDP from falling, monetarists wanted a big change in the money supply to make up for the huge decline in velocity. But now that we have started spending money again and the velocity has picked up, what they would want is, okay, let's start reining in the money supply a little bit to stop that push from going too far. Because eventually, if you push the money supply too far, monetarists say inflation. That's what's going to happen. All right, so we have learned that there are two standard types of policy that can affect the macroeconomy: fiscal policy, monetary policy. What's fiscal policy again? Government spending and government taxing. Again, think of it as taxing on us. Monetary policy, that's the Fed, changing the money supply and interest rates. We have now also learned that there are three types of economists. There are Keynesians, there are classicalists, and there are monetarists. So, what do Keynesians feel about fiscal policy?
Spend, spend, spend.
That's right, all right? They say this is the best way to cure the economy. And how does it work? It works through the taxing and the spending multipliers, right? Increasing aggregate demand, because when the government spends, you're going to multiply that spending by whatever the spending multiplier is, and that's what's going to push aggregate demand and make your economy turn around. All right? Now, what do Keynesians say about monetary policy? Well, it's okay. They're not against it. Right, so increase M2, lower interest rates, raise aggregate demand, increase GDP. So those are the steps that I was talking about a little bit ago about how increasing the money supply increases GDP. But notice all the steps you have to go through. I mean, there's 4 steps that this change in money supply has to make in order to make GDP grow, right? What Keynesians will say, it's okay, but too slow, right? So they don't dislike it. So in other words, if government can't spend money because it's too dysfunctional, like, say, now, Keynesians will say, okay, if government can't pull its head out of itself, at least the Fed can, okay? So Keynesians are actually okay with what the Fed is doing right now because they understand that the government can't do anything. They're like, okay, Fed, keep pushing quantitative easing because the government can't figure out how to spend money. And in fact, what are most politicians screaming about? They're screaming about debt, 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 killing children, killing babies, right? Which is terrible, terrible thing. But that's, apparently that's what debt does. So we need to stop getting into more debt. We need to start paying it down. And we are. And in order for the economy to keep growing, though, somebody has to go the other direction. And so that's why the Fed easing is working. Okay? Now, what do classical economists think about fiscal policy?
Boo.
Right. No! Just creates inflation. And what do classical economists say about monetary policy?
No.
No! Just creates inflation. So, what does fix the economy for classical economists?
Sitting on your hands.
Time. What's the key to time? Economy will recover due to what? Flexible wages and prices, right? People have to be willing to accept pay cuts. And once they do accept pay cuts, prices will have to go down because they won't have enough money to pay for stuff. Businesses will also have to accept less profit.
Just realized how many classical economists friends I have.
I mean, it really is a logical way to run the economy. It's just unfortunate. Yeah. It would work in a time where there wasn't a cell phone and there wasn't the internet and there wasn't lots of information available to you all the time and powerful unions and powerful companies and powerful governments and enough said. All right. True. Yeah, it's classical. All right, so what do monetarists say about fiscal policy? They actually say no. The reason that monetarists don't like fiscal policy is the crowding out effect. That the increasing debt will eventually lead to higher interest rates. And remember that according to monetarists, the only thing that's good is monetary policy. And in order for monetary policy to affect the economy, it has to be able to affect interest rates without any interference at all. Right? So if the Fed can step in and do its job, it has to be able to do it without government debt causing a problem. But if government debt starts to make it such that the Fed can't lower interest rates, then we got a problem. Okay? So that's why monetarists say, look, the government has to quit going into debt, because eventually, once it gets so far in debt, interest rates are going to rise, and that's going to stop monetary policy from working. And that's the only thing that does work, right? So for monetarists, monetary policy is the right way of doing things, right? Steady growth in M2 leads to steady has an E and an A, growth in GDP. So this table, basically I want you to have this table in your head, because I'm probably going to ask you 3 or 4 questions on it. I'll put out something saying, you hear that the government is going to go deeper into debt by spending additional money, right? So they're going to start a new stimulus package of, $2 trillion. And I'm going to say, how would your response be to that if you were a Keynesian economist? Exactly. So government spending, fiscal policy, that's your job, right? Now, if I told you all of a sudden you're a monetarist, what would you say?
Nope.
We'd say bad. This is going to cause the crowding out effect. It's going to cause interest rates to rise, and then monetary policy won't be effective. Okay? So the idea here is that I'm giving you tools to argue. All right? And I'm going to basically put you in a party and tell you, here's what, which party you will be at. You will be at the Keynesian party, the monetarist party, or the classicalist party. And then I will say, here come events, and you're supposed to argue like you're one of those people. And then part B will come along to that question, and you will switch parties, right? And now you get to have same thing happen, but now give me a different argument, okay? And the idea is to give you brain flexibility, right? So that you can not only see your own side, but see the other person's side, right? I mean, that's the whole point of arguing, is so that you can not only argue for yourself, but actually for the exact thing you would argue against if you had to, right? Yeah. I mean, it helps you to make a good argument, right? So that you don't talk about how debt kills babies, because that's not a good argument. Not in an economics class. That's right. Okay. So this is the meat and potatoes of not only chapter 20, but really chapters 11 through 20. Okay? This is what we were getting at, is the arguments for how the economy gets adjusted, how it becomes better and or worse. Homework. Page 447 is what I have. Is that right?
446 starts on the
So numbers 4, 5, 9, and 10. Yeah.
I bet there are questions that you have to have.
still have to read it. So, all right, so realize that next week we will cover a little bit of Chapter 21. So Chapter 21 is where we talk a little bit about international economics, at least enough to draw some graphs. So we will talk a little bit about Chapter 21.